and welcome back to Book and Page. We are on Chapter 11 of The Place of the Lion by Charles Williams. This is the conversion of Damaris, where I am going to try and focus again on some of the philosophical images we're receiving here, with the recognition that there is still a concerning amount of patriarchal bullshit happening. But we're going to try and talk about some of the other things around that, just keeping in mind that that is still there. So, let's talk about quickly what happens in this scene. So, Damaris is suddenly going to be deeply aware of what is actually happening. So, she is at home, and another reason to be upset has appeared. The field that her house used to look out upon has been purchased, and they're putting up some housing. And she's kind of mad about this. And we'll talk about the problems with her anger about this. Though she does, again, her brain goes right back to her project, and she's thinking about her appendices and the charts that she's very proud of, that she's figured out. There's 3 of them, and there's 6 appendices. So she's focused very much on that, but becomes distracted when she hears some noises and ends up looking out at the new construction just in time to watch it all collapse. Now her initial thought is, they didn't even make it out of good materials, until wham! This thing comes flying at her and attacks her in her house. And it's this bird-like creature that the narration calls a pterodactyl. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. Who is constantly trying to get in and get at Damaris. She tries to flee, calling out for help from everybody, and ends up running into her father in the hall. Now at first he seems sympathetic, but he very quickly rejects her and leaves her by herself in this moment. She collapses and ends up in her own vision, where she is stuck in a swamp, and Abelard comes through, only to have the shadow of this pterodactyl pass over him, and she watches him become corrupted before her eyes. The corruption is dragging her down and trying to suffocate her, until she hears her name called by none other than Anthony. She responds, and he ends up coming, and the eagle that is traveling with him chases the pterodactyl away, and all the crazy stuff calms down, and they're able to sit down and talk things out. Damaris starts that conversation with an apology for her poor attitude and how she's been treating Anthony. And Anthony ultimately finally explains what's going on after Damaris insists that she'll believe him no matter what he says at this point. Upon getting the full story, she realizes that just like her father rejected her, she rejected Quentin, and so it's become her duty to go out into the world and find Quentin if he still survives. Anthony sort of recognizes he was going to do that, but now that his eyes are open, he himself cannot, and they agree this is probably Damaris's job now. Yeah. Short summary, and that's because, again, we get a lot of visceral descriptions about this pterodactyl attack and the swamp that Damaris finds herself in. Now, like I said, I'm going to try and focus on some of the images and the ideas here, because I like to think that they're meaningful no matter the gender of the person being affected. Now, the previous parts of the books tells me that's not true, but sometimes you gotta reject part of the book and pull out the parts you like. Just like I can like certain parts of old philosophers, like Aristotle. I like his virtues. His natural slave argument, not so much. So I'm going to try and do that. Recognizing again that macho manliness of I'm in charge and I'm always right is there, but we're going to see what images we have that could affect people no matter the gender of Damaris. First and foremost is the way we start this chapter with the rejection of the construction. Because this is another building block in sort of the issues with Damaris. And again, I'm going to treat Damaris as if gender here is not an issue. It definitely is, but tons of my previous videos have highlighted some of those problems. So I want to look again, it's sort of like the first time we met Damaris, and the interrogation of that type of academic, which again can be all types of genders, right? So let's look at that here, because we're running into some of those problems again. The discussion about the buildings being built is another one of these problems that Damaris doesn't seem to quite be thinking through, because she seems to reject the building of these places on principle of the type of people that will live there. Because tons of people would have rejected it simply for, again, humans continuing to infringe on the natural world and the natural beauty. But that's not what Damaris is seeing here, right? It's not, this field brings me comfort and beauty and I like to lie in it and watch the stars. This is, it was there and now all these people are here and they're going to be stupid people who do things wrong. They do them differently than I do. And it's that weird, like, different type of folks that is not poor folks. This isn't going to be like low-income housing, because they're still playing tennis, but they're doing it for a business. There might even be a mind among them, but not PhD level like Damaris. So it really is this recognition of everything that's currently going on in Damaris's understanding and world revolves fully around Damaris, which is not how the world works. And the interesting parallel then is actually with Damaris's father here, Mr. Tai, because he seems to be on the opposite spectrum. He would be the one that would look at this new construction and cry because the natural world is being infringed upon and the butterflies won't have the space. He is really that natural beauty aesthetic moment, while Damaris is all mind. And neither of these people are doing very well in this chapter, because Mr. Tai has not, in fact, become like Anthony and perceived the truth of these forms and ascended with them. He's just kind of stopped dead. He's perceived the beauty of the form of butterfly, but he doesn't seem to be perceiving any of the other forms beyond very much, and he's slowly just being broken down by the beauty of the butterfly. Anthony is surviving so far because he's suddenly become aware not only of all of this beauty and form and divinity, but he also has recognized that he still has work on in the world. Mr. Tai doesn't have that, so he's just wasting away. He's not eating anymore. He's not doing anything. So we actually do have these two people who are closely related together, who are ultimately at sort of a point of no return. There needs to be a turn in this moment, or it's going to be utter destruction. And Mr. Tai, Anthony says, is sort of beyond that point. Because, again, before he had seen the butterfly, he always spoke about wanting to have some sort of connection with his daughter. That seems to be the complaints that he and Anthony always have with each other, wanting this connection, but with Damaris being so focused on the mind, and on her mind, not being able to have this connection. But in this moment of trying to make the connection, Damaris trying to connect with him for help, he actually rejects her. And that's, again, partially because he's wasting away, and she's not the beauty of the butterfly, so there's nothing more here. So we do have these two people who are experiencing the forms in the wrong way, just like a lot of our other ones have, but it's a question of being possessed. Mr. Tai doesn't seem to have been possessed, but Damaris is possibly in the process of getting possessed by this creature. And I'm kind of mad they call it a pterodactyl, because I honestly think a vulture would have been a fantastic image for this, because suddenly we're not quite sure if this is a creature in its own right, or if this is the antithesis of the eagle. Because we've been told, of course, the story of the dragon. The dragon is another one of these forms, but a fallen angel. The dragon is Satan, who attempted to fight the angels and was defeated and rejected, but he was an angel. So the pterodactyl here could be one of these fallen forms that's actually then echoing one of the ascendant forms, the eagle, right? Because the eagle then comes in. They're both bird-like creatures. And I think they chose pterodactyl with this idea of it being sort of this ancient, like, still earthly thing, but really easy to forget about until it comes creeping up on you. Because I think then, if it's meant to be the antithesis of the eagle, and the eagle is wisdom, that what we're seeing in this moment is that self-possessed wisdom that means you don't have any wisdom at all. And again, I'll pull from Plato here, and specifically Socrates. Because Socrates always said that the Oracle of Delphi called him the wisest man, precisely because Socrates recognized he didn't know anything. And that would say then that the eagle would speak to Socrates. And this pterodactyl would speak to everybody else. Because Socrates then goes around and talks with people, trying to find someone more wise than him, except he finds that all of these people think they know everything, and it turns out they don't know anything. And that's Damaris, right? Damaris is precisely that, or the narration has told us Damaris is precisely that. Again, even in the discussion of Damaris's paperwork and appendices and charts, it's Damaris showing, I know all of these things. All of these things. I have a full understanding of thought process through humanity. And so then the pterodactyl shows up. Why I would have loved for it to be the vulture is the vulture is a more earthly creature than a pterodactyl. It's much more visceral and real to now. The pterodactyl was a creature that existed on the world, but currently does not. And I think the vulture being a scavenger is precisely speaking to this self-possessed knowledge, because a vulture then consumes the bodies of other beings to nourish itself. And I think that image is precisely what Williams is trying to get to with Damaris and academics like Damaris, is this need to just stand there and pick and pick and pick and pick and eat and say, ta-da, look, aren't I amazing? Because I've picked at all of these previous people and discovered the real truth about them, and rejected the false truth about them. It is this feeding off of the carcasses of what's come before. But they go with pterodactyl. I think some of that imagery is still there. And again, it's the antithesis of the eagle here. That is just, like, it's that visceral type of thing where you realize, again, there has to be a turn. Same with the swamp vision and the change in Abelard, because we've spoken previously about being able to find the truth of the world, find a path to God through acceptance and recognition of all of God's creations. And Abelard can be that perfect Abelard that first comes out, who is older but still looks young and glows and is singing the praises of God that he has written. That is precisely the Abelard that could lead us to ascent. But the change then is, again, once the shadow of this self-possessed idea of wisdom passes over Abelard, Abelard suddenly becomes a distraction. He becomes a corruption, because you're not focused on something outside of yourself and Abelard. You're not aiming towards God. You are feeding back into yourself, and Abelard becomes the carcass in which you're feeding yourself from. So it's like just a fantastic image for that issue that, like, makes you feel gross, and it should, it's supposed to, which is part of the reason why, again, there is the hope that this image would apply to all genders. It is not purely a feminine issue. Because if it is a feminine issue, then there's something being said here about a portion of the population, which is you don't tend to possess true wisdom, you tend to be very self-obsessed. And like I've said in previous videos, things that Anthony tends to get praised for are, like, castigated in poor Damaris. So it is sort of this, like, moment where you really hope there's a difference, but there's an uncomfortable subversion of, I'll say, the Christian act of confession and penance, but there are certain sects of Christianity that this could be more applicable to. And it's this uncomfortable subversion that, again, is highlighting Damaris's female nature in a deeply uncomfortable way. Because up to this point, we've seen an echo of other things that are happening, that have been happening to masculine characters as well as feminine characters. Like the snake possessing Miss Wilmot, lion possessing Mr. Oh, what's his name? Foster. The lion possessing Mr. Foster. And Mr. Ty rejecting Damaris, just as Damaris rejected Quentin. There is sort of the imagery here, but the focus for Anthony, and part of what helps perfect him as this being that can then speak to the forms, is his relationship with Damaris. And again, like I've said in previous videos, it doesn't seem to be a positive relationship. It's not an equal one. It is Adam having, like, control over the animals, including Eve, type of relationship. And in this moment, there are some very strange pieces, especially, again, when everything first calms down. So she calls out for Anthony, and she really wants Anthony. She calls out for other people, including her father, but she really wants Anthony. And Anthony comes and calls her name in response. She responds to him, and he calls her name again, forcing her to open her eyes. And they end up sitting down, and Damaris goes to apologize. What was it? He looked at her gravely. I wonder what you'll say if I tell you. Again, I have problems with the fact that he didn't tell her sooner, but whatever. I shall believe you, she answered simply. Anthony, I'm sorry. The laughter broke out again in his eyes. And why are you sorry, my cousin? Again, just ignore that bit. It was perfectly fine back when this was being written. I behaved very badly, Damaris said. To tell him seemed to her more important than anything else in the world could be, even the vanished monstrosity. Anthony took her hand again and kissed it. And how have you behaved badly, my cousin? He asked. I've tried to make use of you, Damaris said, beginning to blush. I've been the firstborn of Lilith, who is an illusion, and Samuel the accursed, Anthony finished. Yes, darling, but that doesn't matter between us. It isn't that which you saw. So again, Anthony's saying, like, the form that came to her is not the using of people. It seems to be, again, the self-obsessed wisdom. But, one, thanks. She's trying to apologize, and you just called her the firstborn of Lilith. If you're wondering, Lilith was supposedly the first woman created for Adam, made out of dust along with Adam, and then she got the idea in her head, because both of them were made by God from dust, that they're equal partners here. And so Lilith gets rejected, becomes the mother of monsters, and Eve is created from the rib of Adam so that she's subservient to him. So that image is just modern day all over the place. But I want to focus again on the subversion of the confession here. Because Anthony actually interrupts Damaris. He does not allow Damaris to finish and have the self-knowledge to recognize how she's acted and describe it. Which is just really weird. Because if you've never done confession before, the priest is just supposed to listen. The priest doesn't, in most cases, tell you what you've done wrong. The point of confession, the art of confession, is that you have the self-awareness to be able to go in and say, I have made these mistakes. I made these choices, they were wrong. The priest usually confirms that, and then the other subversion here is the priest in certain sects is then supposed to give you penance. Whether it's a certain number of prayers you're supposed to do, or they tell you to go and volunteer in a shelter or something, they are supposed to give you penance. You admit your faults, your sins, priest listens, thinks about it, and decides the appropriate action that you will take to gain forgiveness. The exact opposite has happened here. Like I said, Anthony has actually interrupted Damaris, which is why, again, I don't think a lot of this can be considered Damaris, no matter what gender Damaris is. Because Anthony right away brings it back to the fact that she's a woman, firstborn of Lilith. Now, again, he does say that wasn't the form that she saw, and the form then, and all the previous things we could discuss, could be applicable no matter the gender. But what follows here does center on Damaris's her gender, because suddenly she still doesn't have the self-awareness to be able to properly speak and admit how she has been acting. Anthony helps her do it. But Damaris then is the one to give herself penance, which is saying, I ought to go and find Quentin. Like, she recognizes, with Anthony's help, how she felt with her father rejecting her is precisely how Quentin likely felt with Damaris rejecting her. It is two human beings who know each other, who have some sort of relationship. Here, a father-daughter relationship that's been rejected, and Quentin's friendship with Anthony, thus extending the friendship with Damaris, being rejected. And so Damaris does have some self-reflecting moments here, where she suggests her own penance. I need to go and find Quentin and make up for the fact that I rejected him as my father rejected me. But again, Anthony ends up helping her along here, because he holds her hand and sort of forces her to look at all of this. Before he even tells her what's happening. Like, she does have to go through it before she can know the truth. At first he doesn't, like, he takes her hand, so first he rejects her. He sort of separates himself, drops her hand, and says, like, just completely, you saw what you know, he said, and because it's the only thing you know, you saw it like that. You've been told about it often enough. You've been warned and warned again. You've had it whispered to you and shouted at you, but you wouldn't stop or think or believe. And again, I have a problem with this, because no, she doesn't actually know what's going on. He hasn't sat down and explained everything. And what you wouldn't hear about what you've seen, and if you're still capable of thanking God, you'd better do it now. You with your chatter about this and the other, your plottings and plannings and your little diagrams and your neat tables, what did you think you would make of the agonies and joys of the masters? Because again, it's that self-obsessed knowledge. I know what I'm doing, and I'm just consuming and consuming and consuming. Oh, I know such things must be. We must shape to ourselves the patterns in which they said. Man must use his mind. But you've done more than use it. You've loved it for your own. You've loved it and you've lost it. And pray God you've lost it before it was too late, before it decayed in you and sent out that stink which you smelled, or before the knowledge of life turned to the knowledge of death. Somewhere in you there was something that loved truth, and if you ever studied anything, you'd better study that now, for perhaps you won't get another chance. So Anthony has confirmed exactly what's happening. Like, because again, this is not Damaris recognizing her errors. It is Anthony telling her, this is the mistake you made. And then she says, like, will you explain to me what happened? And he does. And again, he won't let go of her hand at one point. It's this full recognition of you have to face this down. But it's not a self-recognition. It is an external, Anthony knows what's best and tells her. But she does extrapolate from that and has enough agency to be able to say, I know what's happening. Though, again, she has to ask permission to do it. Because Anthony then says, I was going to do that, but I don't think I ought. And that's just it. That's the decision made. Though I will say something very interesting. Before Damaris gets the full amount of information about what's been happening, she pauses. He says, like, do you really want me to tell you? And she stops and says, why did you come? And he says, because I heard you call for me. So that tells us, again, Damaris does have some power here. Anthony didn't just arrive because it was the right thing to do, or because he has to face down all the forms. He arrived because Damaris, in her moment of terror, asked Anthony for help, and he provided it. So there is that, but he then tells her all the mistakes she made. That's not self-reflection. And she then is given the ability to decide what to do next. So that is kind of a full subversion of the confession and penance sort of system that we've previously seen. Damaris isn't so fully aware to know exactly what, and to articulate exactly the mistakes she made in the past, but she does get to make the decision of her choices in the future. So, I like parts of this chapter, but there's still that underlying relationship issue between Anthony and Damaris that can still undercut a lot of these ideas. How much of this is applicable if it turns out Damaris is a guy, or neither gender, or not related to Anthony, or have a relationship with him in any way? I think it would change a lot of things, which is annoying, because I like to think that this book is trying to tell us something about human nature altogether, and not necessarily about the nature of man and the nature of woman. And the nature of Kat, which is for me to pay attention to her, because I'm also talking to the camera. So, this is my penance, I guess. I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.